Dan, when you heard us give all the numbers, you had a chance to take a look at Apple's sales numbers, its bottom line numbers as well. This is still a phone company at the end of the day, and the economic slowdown, the supply chain woes, and the dependency on China are really weighing on its top line.
Yeah, it seemed like all the negative things that we were worried about actually came to fruition in this report, right? And I think in the back of a lot of investors' minds, we were kind of hopeful and optimistic that maybe Apple could weather the storm. But as you guys mentioned, it looks like a pretty big miss on iPhones. I think the street was a little over 68 billion. It came in, what, 65.5 billion. The other thing that kind of stood out to me, and when I was kind of getting ready to prepare for Apple, is I noticed that if you looked at their year-over-year growth, we were expecting iPhone growth to be down about 5%. But we're looking for growth coming out of their other segments, like you mentioned before, wearables and iPad and so forth. And those actually all missed. And I don't believe that they posted positive year-over-year growth. We'll have to dig a little deeper. But the only shining stars you mentioned before, it looks like services, which was up around 5%.
Let me just jump in because it looks like iPad revenue did beat analyst estimates. So I guess we should give credit where credit is due.
Let's get some credit.
Yeah, $9.4 billion for iPad revenue versus the consensus estimate of $7.78 billion. But to your point, this is small potatoes compared to the iPhone, which brought in $65.78 billion in revenue in the first quarter.
Yeah, we're all worried about the supply constraints over what was happening in China. We're worried about the shutdowns of the plant. Every analyst were tripping over themselves going into this quarter, trying to lower their unit expectations for iPhones. I heard 6 million up to 10 million in terms of dropping it down. And it looks like we did finally see Apple kind of come to earth, right? In the past, they'd have been able to go through all these issues with supplies and so forth and been able to deliver great numbers. But it looks like on this first quarter, this holiday quarter, it kind of finally caught up to them. And obviously, consumer discretionary spending is pulling back because the economy is pulling back. So a lot of things, a lot of headwinds finally came to land here, it looks like, and roost on this Apple report.
And it looks like shareholders agree. Shares still lower after hours, down to the tune about 3%. But Dan, you brought up services, and I want to talk about that a little more because, again, it looks like a pretty big miss across the board, particularly for the iPhone. When you think about what could be the next shining star, the next cash cow, I mean, can services really offset what we might continue to see, continued weakness on the iPhone side?
Well, just think about this. The services revenue figure is about 20 billion and iPhone was 65 billion, right? Just on this quarter. So it's about a third of overall iPhone revenues. And, you know, there's been a lot of reports that have come out in the past that said, hey, we can live off services, right? We can just live off of the growth in the service business. He said they hit over 2 billion devices are out there. It was 190 billion. 1.9 billion. So can we live off that? And the reality is they have to work together, right? They have to lay out the new phones that bring in more people or new hardware like Macs and iPods, iPads and so forth to bring in the device users, and then they're able to monetize the device users through services. But unfortunately, I don't think services alone can drive the forward. Like you were talking about earlier, everyone's waiting for that next leg of growth, right? What's that next great product that can come out and carry Apple going forward? So we'll have to see.
Well, I want to bring Caroline into this as well because you've given us such a complete overview of Apple. What does this mean for the Apple ecosystem, all the suppliers that it relies on, many of them in Asia? Every time Apple has a new release, their shares move and are jumping around based on what people think is going to happen.
And down we go. Skyworks lower, TSMC lower. A lot of the supply chain are going to be hit by this. Apple wringing its hands over its own supply chain, of course, all related on Foxconn and the manufacturing of some of its units. But the screens, the displays, the areas in which they draw from others, the supply chain is so heavily impacted, therefore. So, yeah, we're already seeing some of these names, Skyworks and TSMC, fall in sympathy. And in many ways, this is going to, given the run-up and given the bull market that we've gone back into on the NASDAQ, I think a lot of this pullback in Amazon, Alphabet and Apple is probably going to take the wind out of the sails of Asia trading.
And one of the headlines that we haven't talked about much when it comes to the Apple earnings, and Dan, I'm going to toss this to you. They're maintaining their quarterly dividend at 23 cents a share. And when you think about the impacts of dividends, when you think about buybacks, I mean, what can this company do to entice shareholders to really stay involved here as it searches for that next cash cow? I mean, is 23 cents enough to do it?
Well, you know what's interesting is Apple's a company that has tremendous amount of cash on their balance sheet. So they can use that to increase a dividend. They can use that to do share repurchases. They did that about 5 or 6 years ago. You may remember when they were struggling a little bit in China. So I would not be surprised if with the slowdown that we're seeing in iPhone revenue growth turning actually negative, that you may start to see them do a little bit of financial engineering on their statements and say, hey, we're going to bump the dividend up or we're going to buy a bunch of shares, and that'll increase enthusiasm again back in the stock as a value play.
How much are you banking on that happening? I go back to the DVD page on the Bloomberg terminal, and Apple usually declares an increase in dividend in late April when it reports the second quarter numbers. So I'm looking for, if they do raise their dividend, it would be around then. How much is that, do you think, priced in now, given the disappointing results that we got today and the difficult macro environment that Apple finds itself in?
I think that's definitely in the cards going into the next quarter, right? This is going to, because we just did the holiday quarter, so we'll go in the spring quarter. So I wouldn't be surprised if they do come out with an announcement to do that. Like I said before, the stock was down. I don't know if you guys remember this. I've been in Apple for like 25 years. Stock was way down. Nobody liked it because they had some new phones coming out that weren't going and receiving well. It's like 2013 through 14 and in China, and they came out and announced a stock split and increased the amount of dividend and bought back shares, and everybody went bonkers for the stock. So there's ways they can tool things when things are down.